because if you had many of the symptoms, you wouldn't know that this is related to mast cells. You wouldn't know that they're related to EDS or fibromyalgia. So how are they going to look for it on the web? So we felt, well, if you look for mystery symptoms, if you find the video, then you might actually find it helpful. And it was interesting because in half a day, we did about 5 hours of filming, and then it's a long video, it's about an hour, but it has good websites at the end that you can refer to depending on the medical problems, etc. Next, please. So this slide is probably one of the most important slides in my career for a number of reasons.
Picture of that.
As I said earlier, many of you, as many patients with many of the diseases that I've already mentioned, go to physicians and they list about 20 different symptoms and no one believes them. So how do you get physicians to believe you? Well, you might go on average 10 years and 7 physicians and no one believes you. So at the probing of one particular patient, who sort of became a little bit of my assistant over the years, we decided to see if we can publish something in the New England Journal of Medicine. As you probably know, that's the most important medical journal in the world. Well, it took us 3 years to get this done. And it is important, first of all, because it's not about mastocytosis alone, it's mast cell mastocytosis and related disorders. And as you will see in the next slide, one slide shows the mast cell and shows how many different things can trigger the mast cell. It's not just the pollen, and it's not just the biscuits. All kinds of drugs, mold, that I will talk about later, viruses, peptides that are made in your own body can trigger the cells. So it is much, much more general. Now, when we try to convince the journal to even invite me to write, because you cannot just submit, then the question is, who are going to be the reviewers, the blind reviewers that will review this before it is accepted? So I felt I got to invite as co-authors probably the harshest reviewers that I've ever encountered. So that's how Dr. Jem Akin, who's a professor at Harvard, came to be a co-author, and Peter Valent, who's a professor in Vienna, because they're very knowledgeable, but somewhat opinionated. I hope that video will not show everywhere. They're good friends, actually. But what I meant to say is that, Peter Valent is actually a hematologist. Jem Akin is an allergist. They see patients in their own right. So I wanted to cover basically, all bases. So then it took us 59 drafts before it was accepted, and then 10 times correcting the page proofs before eventually it was printed. What is probably the most important is the next slide, where it took us forever to convince the reviewers. There were 4 reviewers unknown to us in the journal. For the mast cell, by being activated by bacteria, fungi, viruses, mold, allergens, drugs, peptides, cytokines, toxins, whatever, can affect every single organ of the body. That's what the patients are coming in and saying, I've got these symptoms and no one believes them. But now, I tell the patients, just take this publication or this picture and show it to your physician, show it to the emergency room, because the journal would not have published this unless they felt that there was something actually there. Now, even though the journal originally felt that this topic is so esoteric, but it was important enough to publish, what is amazing is it was published on the 9th of July. Until now, it has received actually 84,000 hits. It is more than articles or reviews on atherosclerosis or infectious diseases, which means that a lot of physicians were looking for something themselves and they could not quite put the facts together. So many times it is because you're asking, as this colleague of mine, the patient was asking, let's get something that a lot of physicians can read, that actually I got to writing this, because it just takes a lot of work. So a lot of the work that you're doing and a lot of what you're suffering can actually come to fruition. The more you actually talk to your physicians, to your colleagues, to others, because the more things that are published, the more likely the next round of physicians or patients will find it easier to find actually some relief. So how about now mastocytosis? So mastocytosis, the classic mastocytosis is a rare disease, about 1 in 10,000 or so people. I'm not going to go through the slide, but basically to say that if in fact you have the true signs of mastocytosis, eventually you need a bone marrow biopsy, and that will identify subtypes. If you don't actually have positive findings, and I'll show you one of the most important positive findings, then we have to measure certain breakdown products of molecules that are released from the mast cells. So histamine is broken down to methylhistamine, prostaglandins are broken down to PGD2 and PGF2 alpha. If these are elevated in the urine, that indicates, in the absence of bone marrow positive findings, that you have mast cell activation. So the difference is that in mastocytosis, you have too many mast cells, which are also activated, while in mast cell activation, you do not have high number of mast cells, but they're activated. Okay. Now, what do we do for treatment? The treatment is pretty much the same, unless you have a specific subtype, in which case we use a drug that is also used for lymphoma. I'm not going to go into this, but so there is usefulness in doing the proper diagnosis, because in certain cases, there might be ways to address this. Next, please. Now, the telltale sign is that if you look at the bone marrow by doing a biopsy, and this is magnified in this case about 100 times, in this case about 1,000 times, these are actually fat cells in bone marrow. You see those brown cells. So there's a collection here of about, I don't know, maybe almost 100 cells. Each one of these is a mast cell, and it's stained brown because it contains an enzyme. It's a meat tenderizer. It's called tryptase. And you can imagine the meat tenderizer is released in your muscle, what it's going to do to the muscle. But we'll get back to the muscle a little later. If you look at it at high magnification, you can stain for a molecule that is on the surface of the cell that makes the cells grow. It's called the growth factor receptor, CQ, and you can see that those cells stain. Now the reason I'm showing this picture, and I'm sort of picking and choosing here, is because in one particular case, one individual had just a few of these spots. This is called cutaneous mastocytosis. So you can have a few or you can have a lot. In this particular case, she had only a few. But suddenly, she, well maybe not suddenly, but she underwent a very, very difficult divorce. Within 48 hours, she was covered with this. And then we biopsied these new lesions, and here you see 2 of these cells, and already releasing their content. Anything that is black is what is remaining. There usually it's like a soccer ball filled with about 500 ping pong balls, each one containing about 50 molecules, only one of which is histamine. And we only address histamine, and we will talk about the other molecules later. Next, please. So even in this condition, you can see how physicians can be absolutely puzzled. And this is taken from the New England Journal of Medicine article as well. Because for every organ, there's another disease that might be mimicking your symptoms. And you can imagine, even the best of physicians can be very confused. And I am very often confused. In certain cases, the treatment is not going to be any different. So if you have anxiety, we'll probably address the anxiety no matter what the anxiety is. But in other cases, there might be different problems and different ways to address it. So if you have, let's say, vasculitis, we might do a vessel muscle biopsy and find out if there's inflammation both in the blood vessels and the muscle, and that the treatment there will be, let's say, steroids, which we don't necessarily use in EDS. But some of the symptoms might be very similar because you might have muscle pain, weakness, etc. So that's why it's so important to make sure that we don't miss some other diagnosis. Next, please. So how about the mast cell? So I told you that the mast cell is like a soccer ball filled with about 500 of these things that contain all these molecules. And until recently, we were teaching that the main trigger of the mast cell is an allergen to which an antibody was made called IgE, and the IgE uniquely sits on the mast cells, nowhere else, and is waiting there. So if you were, let's say, exposed to some allergen, you made IgE, the IgE is sitting on the mast cells, and if you're re-exposed to the antigen that bridges 2 or more of these antibodies and causes a chain of reactions we still don't understand very well, leading to what we call degranulation, or release of the content of the granules outside the cell. But this is, as it turns out, the tip of the iceberg. For years, we were missing the forest for the trees, because I was looking for the mast cells to degranulate as an index that they were involved in pathology, and they didn't.